let me invite on stage Mr. Vilas Dhar, President of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, to keynote this fourth edition. Welcome on stage, and please, Vilas, deliver your address. Welcome.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. What an inspiring beginning. And so I must start also with gratitude to you, Vice President Cayley, to the Future Society, to Elon Tech, to the commissioners of U.S. agencies here in the room, to you, Eva Medel, and to the experts and philosophers and humanists and lawmakers who join us today. I was struck with two personal realizations, and if you'll indulge me, I'll share them. The first one a little bit flippant. I started 20 years ago beginning to think about what emerging models of AI might look like and their impacts on society. These conversations often began in poorly lit computer labs, in little basement rooms, postscripts to technical conferences, maybe faculty lunchrooms. And here today we sit at the European Parliament. So I think, first of all, I thank you for this incredible opportunity to really address an incredible set of policymakers. The second one, though, is a little bit more critical. When we started this work 20 years ago, we often talked about envisioning a future where AI might have significant impacts on humanity and how we might bring our creativity to think about new policy structures. What might we need to be in place? How would we make sure we would be prepared when the AI future was here? This year, I think not a single person in this room will say we should be prepared for a future where AI is present. Rather, we are living it now. The implementation of these systems is widespread. The effects on people, on the planet, is obvious, and it is, more than anything else, accelerating. And yet I'm deeply concerned that our institutions are not prepared. That even as we continue to think about regulation, as we think about the rule of law, we're behind the curve. I see in our work at the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation around the world, the way that these systems are intersecting directly with the front line of vulnerability, where people are facing surveillance, where their information is being used to create disadvantageous outcomes, where adversarial actors are using these tools, and our institutions are not yet prepared. Two personal reflections with you because it highlights the criticality of the moment, the convening that's happening here today and the work that we must take forward. And I'd like to share with you three interventions that come from our perspective in civil society. The first is an opportunity to consider that the work around the rule of law, around developing legislation and regulation, of developing new governmental practices, faces a deep existential choice. Do we build those approaches in ways that propagate the systems of today, that take with them, of course, thousands of years of work on participation, justice, and inclusivity, but also hold intrinsic to them the propagation of inequality that we see all around us in the world today? Or do we use this as an opportunity to reconceptualize what institutions might look like in an AI-enabled future? One where the cornucopia of economic opportunity meets new modes of participation, of new forms of civic discourse, of new democratic principles that emerge when we move from representative models to truly participative ones. These questions are not merely intellectual anymore. They require us to look at the trans and multi-border nature of data and AI. It forces us to examine the very nature of a nation state or of a bloc and what it means to try to regulate actors who are deploying technologies that don't even consider political boundaries when they think about the economic and social effects of their interventions. And it allows us to look to those successes, whether the UN Declaration of Human Rights or multinational new instruments that have been created, to consider whether regulation, a necessarily sometimes reactive procedure, can be turned into a generative way of creating new conversations across borders. The second intervention I would share with you is, for the last 20 years that I've been involved in this work, more for many of the experts in this room, the conversation has often been dominated first by technology nerds and then by policy wonks, by the individuals who are really at the forefront of creating new technologies and describing their impacts on society. And yet we come to a juncture now where the deployment of these technologies are no longer merely a technological matter. They describe more than code bases or new models. And even as we'll hear over the next few days about new foundation models that are being created, both in the private sector and open source, we must consider the impacts they have on people. And what that requires then is for us to expand the conversational space, to move beyond policy merely as a political tool, but to understand that the effects of those policies will have truly human implications and require us to engage historians and philosophers, creative artists, and those who think about everything from educational pipelines to thinking about labor economics. There's no better place to do that, I suppose, than the halls of government, and yet it requires a newly stated intention to do so. And the third comment I might share with you today is the understanding that this is not merely an opportunity in regulation, an opportunity to re-envision systems, but includes within it as well a moral imperative. An understanding that as we've dealt with new forms of industrial transformation or technological advancement in human society, we've often relied on market forces to understand that the propagation of new opportunity must necessarily be coupled with new vulnerabilities. I stand here to share with you today that I think that's absolutely incorrect. That the world that we look to in the future of design with intention might allow us to both bring forward economic opportunity, new market actors, the forces that inspire innovation and inspiration, but also start from a basic bedrock of human equity, of inclusivity and human rights, a new definition of technological promise that takes into account what we can be if we are both inspired by and are the inspirations for the technology that we create. I share these three thoughts with you because I've been reflecting on this again in a very personal way. I spent some time recently with some young people, members of the Lakota Sioux tribe of indigenous people in North America. And we brought to them a consortium of teachers, all of them indigenous experts in artificial intelligence, to share with them what it looks like to build new technologies and new tools. Now, these were kids who had never coded before, that by virtue of socioeconomic and policy matters, barely had access to digital tools in their classrooms. And yet in 3 weeks, I saw something quite inspirational. These students sat down and with a little bit of training and a lot of support, they built for themselves a new artificial intelligence model. Something I hope everybody in this room someday has a chance to do. It's quite an inspiring technological thing to do. But these kids said, we don't merely want to build or train a new AI model. Can we train it on something that means something to us? And here's what they ended up doing in 3 weeks. They built a tool, an app that sits on your phone. You can take it into the traditional lands of the Lakota Sioux, and you can aim it at different plants that you see around you. It makes these plants so important to the culture and history of the people and identify. It gives you the Latinate name. It gives you a link to online resources about it. Well, that's a start. Here's what else the app does. It shares with you the name of those plants that you've identified in the traditional languages of the Sioux and Lakota people. It bridges a connection between young people who don't necessarily speak the languages and their elders, their parents and tribal chiefs who do. And in that moment, I saw a new moment of inspiration. And maybe someday, these students said, what we want to do is connect these then to the mythologies of our people. So that as I take a picture of a plant, as AI is involved to recognize it, to share with me what it's called, to help me understand its language, it also connects to a database and tells me why these plants are important to my people, my history, and my culture. I share that story with you because here, as we sit to begin to think about the rule of law, as we advance our conversations about policy interventions, about the forms of legislative approaches we might take, the ways that technology companies might change their behaviors, we must stand here in championship of the fact that at the end of the day, these technologies are important because they transform people's lives. They create new connections to cultural histories. They create new opportunities for creative inspiration. They allow us to express ourselves in ways that we haven't had a chance to before. If we center ourselves in human equity and human dignity, the rule of law naturally follows. And for that, I'm quite excited. Thank you.